It started with a piece of paper that looked almost harmless, folded neatly in half and taped to the front door. There was no knock, no courtesy call. Just that thin sheet of white, flapping slightly in the morning breeze as if it carried no weight. But in truth, it was the first domino in a chain of events that would test every ounce of patience, resilience, and sheer stubbornness I had. I'd lived in the neighborhood for almost 7 years, long enough to memorize the cracks in the sidewalk and watch the trees lining the street double in height. The houses here all looked like they were plucked straight from a catalog. Manicured lawns, color-coordinated shutters, and driveways free of a single oil stain. It was one of those places where the HOA didn't just enforce the rules, they relished them. Most of us learned early to keep our heads down, pay the dues, and keep our grass precisely 2 inches high to avoid attention. The letter wasn't even printed on official letterhead, which made it feel strangely ominous. In bold black font, it simply read, "Notice of fine, $200. Violation unapproved fence stain color. Immediate payment required." It was ridiculous. My fence was the same pale cedar it had been since the day I moved in. The only thing I'd done recently was give it a fresh coat of clear sealant to protect it from the summer heat. Apparently, that was enough to send the HOA board into a frenzy. At first, I assumed it was just a clerical error, one of those things a quick phone call would resolve. But when I dialed the number listed at the bottom of the notice, I was greeted with a recorded message directing me to a website that barely functioned. There was no human being to speak with, no reasonable voice on the other end of the line. Just an automated system demanding payment and threatening additional penalties for noncompliance. I shrugged it off, thinking it would blow over. After all, I had nothing to hide. My fence wasn't neon pink. It wasn't even a different shade than before. It was cedar, plain, boring, HOA-approved cedar. Surely, they'd realize the mistake and move on to harassing someone else about their trash cans or flower beds. But the letters kept coming. First weekly, then twice a week. Each one grew more aggressive. Each one stamped with new fees tacked on for late payment. By the third letter, they were warning me about a lien on my property. By the fourth, they'd included language about potential foreclosure proceedings. It all felt absurd. How could a $200 fine spiral into threats to take my home? I wasn't behind on my mortgage, my taxes were paid in full, and I'd never missed a single HOA due in all my years there. But it wasn't about logic. It was about power. The HOA wasn't some faceless institution. It was a handful of people who lived just a few streets over, people who decided they were judge, jury, and executioner when it came to protecting property values. I started noticing things around the neighborhood. The HOA president's house, a massive brick monstrosity on the corner, had freshly repainted shutters that didn't match the approved palette. Another board member's lawn decorations looked like something from a roadside gift shop, gaudy and definitely outside the guidelines. Yet no letters appeared on their doors. No fines. No threats. It wasn't about my fence. It was about them seeing how much they could get away with. And when I didn't pay right away, I'd become their test case. One morning, I woke up to find a stranger taking pictures of my backyard from the sidewalk. Clipboard in hand, polo shirt tucked neatly into khaki pants, the whole uniform of self-appointed authority. When I stepped outside, he didn't say a word, just gave me a thin-lipped smile and walked away, jotting something down as he went. That was when I realized this wasn't going to be solved with a phone call or a friendly chat. The next envelope I received wasn't taped to the door. It came by certified mail, forcing me to sign for it as though I were accepting a delivery of bad news. Inside was the formal notice. If I didn't pay the now $650 in fines and administrative costs, they would initiate foreclosure proceedings under the HOA bylaws. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the letter, the morning sun slanting through the blinds in harsh little stripes. Anger flared first, hot and blinding. Then came disbelief and finally something colder, sharper. A kind of resolve I hadn't felt in years. They thought they could bully me into writing a check. They thought I'd roll over because they had a fancy letterhead and a few legal-sounding phrases. But I wasn't about to lose my house over a clear coat of sealant. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one, and I'd make sure everyone in the neighborhood saw exactly what kind of game they were playing. I started gathering evidence. I took photos of my fence from every angle, printed out the HOA's own approved color charts, and documented every discrepancy I could find in other people's yards. If they wanted to enforce the rules, I'd make sure they applied to everyone. But exposing them wouldn't just be about pointing out hypocrisy. I needed to dig deeper. Who actually benefited from these fines? Where was this money really going? The HOA's financial records were supposed to be public, available to any member who requested them. Yet when I sent an email asking to review them, I received nothing but a curt response telling me I'd have to wait until the next scheduled board meeting. That meeting wasn't for another 3 months. I didn't have 3 months. The foreclosure threats gave me barely 30 days to comply. And then something strange happened. A neighbor I barely knew, a quiet man who jogged past my house every morning, stopped me as I was pulling weeds in the front yard. He glanced around nervously, as though someone might be watching, and muttered something about not being the only one they're doing this to. Before I could ask what he meant, he jogged off again, disappearing around the corner. That was when I knew it wasn't just about me. The HOA had done this before, maybe even successfully. How many other neighbors had paid up or lost their homes without anyone noticing? This wasn't just a fight over a fence anymore. It was something bigger, and if I wanted to win, I'd have to be smarter than every smug board member sitting behind their oak-paneled table. The next move wouldn't be theirs. It would be mine. The first step was figuring out who was really pulling the strings. The HOA had a 5-member board, but everyone knew the real power sat with the president. A man whose name was whispered more than spoken, Howard Latham. He was one of those people who thrived on control, always lurking at the edges of block parties with his sharp eyes and sharper tongue, reminding people to park within the lines or prune their hedges. But there was no way he was doing this alone. I started with public records. Every HOA is supposed to be accountable to its members, which meant somewhere there had to be documents outlining where the money went, dues, fines, and special assessments. I spent hours digging through county records and HOA filings, but what I found didn't add up. The numbers on paper didn't match the stories I heard around the neighborhood. According to their financial reports, the HOA had been spending thousands every month on legal fees and administrative costs, far more than any small neighborhood board should. The problem was that those reports were vague by design. Nothing itemized, nothing specific, just lump sums and obscure descriptions. But buried deep in one filing was the name of a law firm I didn't recognize. A firm with no website, no office address, just a P.O. box across town. It didn't smell right. If this was where all our money was supposedly going, I needed to know who was cashing the checks. At the same time, I started noticing subtle changes in how people treated me. Some neighbors avoided eye contact when I passed by, hurrying back inside their houses as if my fight with the HOA was contagious. Others gave small, sympathetic nods, as though they wanted to help but were too scared to speak up. It was becoming clear that fear was the HOA's greatest weapon. They counted on silence, on people folding under pressure to avoid public conflict. I refused to be silent. I documented everything. I printed every letter they sent me, every threat, every notice taped to my door. I took pictures of their board members' violations, paint colors that didn't match the guidelines, lawn ornaments explicitly banned in the bylaws, vehicles parked overnight on the street without permits. If they wanted to weaponize the rules, I'd show everyone how selectively they enforced them. But evidence alone wouldn't win. I needed leverage. I needed to know how far they'd gone and whether they had crossed the line into outright fraud. That's when I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, even if they wanted to keep me waiting 3 months for official financial records. The meeting wasn't scheduled for another 2 weeks, but I could already feel the tension building. The board held its meetings in the community center, a pristine building that looked more like a wedding venue than a place where neighbors argued about trash bins. I decided to go prepared. I brought my binder full of photos, copies of letters, and the county records I'd dug up. But more importantly, I brought a plan. If I couldn't get them to hand over the records, I'd make them uncomfortable enough to slip up in front of everyone else. In the days leading up to the meeting, I reached out to the quiet jogger who had hinted I wasn't the only one being targeted. At first, he was reluctant to talk. He said he didn't want trouble. But eventually, He admitted the HOA had tried to fine him for improperly stored trash cans, even though his bins were tucked neatly out of sight. They'd piled on late fees until the fine hit $900 before he caved and paid it. Another neighbor told me about a mysterious landscaping violation they'd been charged for even though they hadn't touched their yard in months. It became clear this wasn't about maintaining property values. It was a shakedown. They were manufacturing violations, pushing people until they paid up, and threatening foreclosure if they didn't. How many of those threats had been carried out quietly, without the neighborhood ever finding out? By the night of the meeting, I had a list of names. People who'd been harassed, people who'd paid questionable fines, people who were too scared to speak up. I didn't tell anyone exactly what I planned to do. I just told them to show up. The meeting room was packed. Howard Latham sat at the head of a long table, flanked by the rest of the board, all wearing the same self-satisfied expressions. They called the meeting to order, breezing through agenda items like they were ticking boxes. Landscaping contracts, community pool hours, holiday decorations. And then came the delinquent accounts report. That was my cue. When they mentioned my name, labeling me as non-compliant and delinquent, I stood up. The room went quiet. I laid out every piece of evidence, holding up photos of my fence, copies of their letters, proof that my sealant was HOA approved. I pointed out their own violations, naming names. Murmurs rippled through the room as I listed the people they'd targeted and the inflated fines they'd collected. Howard tried to cut me off, gavel in hand, but I kept going. I asked the questions they didn't want answered. Where was the money really going? Why was a law firm with no office and no website billing thousands every month? Who signed those checks? The room turned hostile, not toward me, but toward them. Neighbors who'd been silent for years started speaking up, demanding explanations. The board fumbled for answers, their polished composure cracking. And then Howard made his first mistake. He said I had no right to question them, that the board wasn't obligated to explain its spending to troublemakers. That was exactly what I needed. I'd been recording the entire meeting. The board tried to adjourn early, but the damage was done. I left the community center that night with more allies than I'd expected. People approached me in the parking lot, thanking me for saying what they'd been too scared to say. Some offered to give sworn statements about their own fines. Others whispered rumors about kickbacks and side deals the board had been running under the table. I didn't have all the proof yet, but I had enough to see the cracks forming. The HOA had spent years bullying people one by one, keeping everyone isolated and afraid. But now the neighborhood knew, and fear was starting to shift away from us and toward them. The next morning, another certified letter arrived. This one was even harsher than the last, demanding immediate payment and warning that foreclosure proceedings would begin in 10 days. But instead of panicking, I smiled. They were getting desperate. They wanted me to fold before the truth came out. They'd just made their biggest mistake yet, giving me a deadline. The 10-day deadline loomed like a storm cloud. Every morning I woke to another notice on my door or another email demanding payment. The board wanted me panicked and scrambling, but instead, I was focused and methodical. If they thought pressure would break me, they didn't realize it only sharpened my resolve. The first thing I did was track that mysterious law firm. A name on a piece of paper is never just a name. I dug through state records, searching business registrations and court filings, until I finally found it. An LLC created less than 2 years ago by a single individual. The registered agent was none other than Howard Latham's cousin. That wasn't just suspicious, it was a smoking gun. If the HOA had been funneling legal fees to a shell company run by the president's relative, it meant money was being siphoned directly from our dues and fines into their own pockets. But suspicion wasn't proof. I needed something solid, something undeniable. I spent hours knocking on doors, talking to anyone willing to open up. Stories poured out faster than I expected. A retired couple had been charged $1,200 for improper shrub trimming, even though their landscaper followed HOA guidelines to the letter. A young family had been threatened with foreclosure over a cracked driveway they'd already repaired. Every account painted the same picture. Inflated fines, arbitrary enforcement, and escalating threats until people paid out of fear. I compiled everything into a thick binder: photos, statements, timelines. The more I gathered, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't about neighborhood standards. It was about revenue. Every violation, real or fabricated, fed the board's personal slush fund. But information alone wouldn't stop foreclosure. I had 10 days to make my move, and I needed to hit them hard enough that they couldn't recover. That's when I decided to bring in outside help. Not a lawyer, because hiring one would play straight into their hands, but someone with investigative experience. An old college friend who'd become a journalist owed me a favor. When I explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. She'd seen enough HOA scandals to recognize one about to erupt. Together, we traced payment records from the HOA's public filings, matching them to bank accounts linked to the bogus law firm. It wasn't perfect proof yet, but it was more than enough to raise serious questions. And questions, when asked loudly enough, are sometimes more dangerous than answers. Meanwhile, word spread fast through the neighborhood. The board had grown used to ruling by intimidation, but now they were facing something new: unity. People who'd been silent for years began comparing notes, realizing their isolated experiences were part of a much bigger scheme. Small gatherings started happening on front lawns and driveways, neighbors whispering about what the board had done. For once, the fear wasn't aimed at us, it was aimed at them. On the 5th day, a second meeting was called, this time an emergency session closed to non-board members. They were nervous. I knew they were trying to get ahead of whatever they thought I was planning. That night, I saw Howard and 2 other board members leaving the community center after hours, carrying boxes to the trunk of a car. If they were moving records, it meant I'd struck a nerve. By the 7th day, the HOA sent another letter, this one from an actual law office, not the fake one. It was a formal notice of foreclosure proceedings, giving me 3 days to pay or lose my house. Instead of scaring me, it told me something important. They were trying to legitimize their scheme at the last minute. If they'd called in real lawyers, it was because they knew their fake setup had been exposed. On the 9th day, I printed copies of everything: bank records, business registrations, neighbor statements, even photos of those late-night box removals. I dropped envelopes on every porch in the subdivision, making sure no one could say they hadn't seen the truth. My journalist friend agreed to run the story if I could get at least 5 sworn statements from affected neighbors. By nightfall, I had 9. The morning of the deadline, I woke before sunrise. The air was heavy, almost electric, as though the neighborhood itself sensed something was about to break. I dressed carefully, grabbed my binder, and walked to the community center where the board was meeting one final time before moving forward with foreclosure. They didn't expect me to show up. They definitely didn't expect the crowd of neighbors trailing behind me, holding their own copies of the evidence. We didn't storm the building, we didn't have to. We just filled the room, quiet but firm, and waited. When the board tried to proceed with business as usual, I spoke up. I laid out everything we'd uncovered, step by step. I described the sham law firm, the money trail, the selective enforcement of rules. I held up sworn statements, one after another, until the table in front of me was buried under proof of their corruption. My voice stayed steady, but inside I could feel adrenaline burning hot, fueling every word. The board members shifted uncomfortably, trading panicked glances. Howard tried to laugh it off, claiming I was spreading lies, but it was too late. Neighbors who'd once been afraid to speak now shouted for answers. The room that had been silent in past meetings erupted with anger. Not at me, but at them. And then I played my final card. I told them the story was already prepared for publication. I told them copies of every document had been sent to the county's oversight office. Even if they moved forward with foreclosure, even if they tried to retaliate, their scheme was over. The meeting collapsed into chaos. Howard slammed his gavel, demanding order, but no one listened. The board abruptly adjourned and stormed out, leaving behind a room full of furious homeowners. For the first time in years, they weren't in control. As I walked home, neighbors stopped me on the sidewalk, shaking my hand, promising their support. I knew the fight wasn't over, the board still held power on paper, and they could still try to retaliate. But now they were exposed. The entire neighborhood had seen who they really were. The foreclosure deadline came and went. No one came to take my house. No sheriff's notice appeared on my door. Instead, a new letter arrived, a revised statement of account, showing my balance as zero. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just quiet backpedaling. But I wasn't finished. Clearing my own name was never enough. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about making sure they could never do this to anyone again. The foreclosure threat had evaporated, but victory felt hollow. The corrupt board hadn't apologized or admitted wrongdoing. They'd simply gone quiet, hoping to ride out the storm. Their silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I knew they were regrouping, counting on time to dull everyone's anger, hoping neighbors would slip back into old habits and forget what had happened. I couldn't let that happen. If I stopped now, they'd pick their next target in a few months and start the same cycle all over again. This fight wasn't about one house anymore. It was about every homeowner who'd been bullied, fined, or threatened into compliance. We needed real change, and that meant replacing the board entirely. The first step was educating people about their rights. Most neighbors didn't even know they had the power to remove board members. HOA rules always sound complicated, full of legal jargon designed to make ordinary people back off. But once I dug into our bylaws, I realized how straightforward it actually was. A simple petition signed by a majority of homeowners could trigger a recall election. If we could organize, we could vote them out. I started going door to door, binder in hand, explaining exactly what the board had been doing. At first, people were hesitant. Years of intimidation had made them wary of taking sides. But I showed them documents, proof of fabricated fines, the bogus law firm, the money trail leading back to Howard Latham's cousin. I reminded them this wasn't just about my fence. This was about their homes, their wallets, their peace of mind. The tide turned faster than I expected. Retirees who'd paid off their houses didn't want to see neighbors forced out. Young families trying to build a future didn't want to live in fear. Slowly, conversations shifted from whispered complaints to open outrage. Neighbors who barely spoke to one another before started meeting in driveways, comparing stories and signing their names on the petition. Within a week, I had more than half the neighborhood on board. The board tried to fight back, sending out slickly worded letters claiming I was spreading misinformation, but their credibility was gone. Too many people had seen the evidence with their own eyes. Some even returned the letters unopened, taping them to their front doors as a quiet act of defiance. The next HOA meeting was unlike anything our subdivision had ever seen. Instead of a handful of board attendees, nearly every homeowner showed up, standing shoulder to shoulder in the community center. The board members walked in looking smug, expecting to reassert their authority, but their confidence melted when they saw the crowd. When the meeting opened, I stood and presented the petition. The room erupted in applause. Not the polite kind, but raw, angry approval from people who'd had enough. The board tried to claim the petition was invalid, waving around copies of the bylaws they thought no one else had read. But I'd come prepared. I read the rules out loud, line by line, showing everyone that we were well within our rights. The board tried to stall, promising to review the petition, but neighbors shouted them down. People who'd been silent for years now spoke up one after another, demanding immediate action. The once powerful HOA president was sweating under the fluorescent lights, his polished composure cracking as his neighbors called him out by name. The board adjourned without addressing a single item on the agenda. They left through a side door, avoiding the angry crowd. That night, I knew we'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They were no longer feared. They were cornered. But I also knew people like Howard Latham don't give up power willingly. He wouldn't just walk away because we asked nicely. If anything, he'd double down, using every trick in the book to hang on to his position. Sure enough, the very next morning, rumors began to spread. Rumors that I was misusing funds, that I had personal grudges, that I wanted to dismantle the HOA entirely. The smear campaign was clumsy, but it showed how desperate they were. I didn't bother responding directly. Instead, I doubled down on transparency. I invited neighbors to my backyard on a Saturday afternoon, laid out every document I had, and walked them through the plan for a recall election. Kids played on the grass while adults signed forms, sipping lemonade and nodding along as they realized just how simple this process really was. The HOA had thrived on secrecy. We would beat them with openness. By the end of that weekend, we had enough signatures to force a special election. The date was set for 3 weeks later, and the entire neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. The board members tried everything to stop it, threatening to sue the petition organizers, sending last-minute letters warning of dire consequences if the election went forward. But no one was scared anymore. The same neighbors who once hid behind closed blinds now waved to me from across the street, smiling as if a weight had been lifted. As election day approached, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. The HOA wasn't some distant, untouchable authority anymore. It was just 5 people who'd abused their positions, and soon they'd be out of power. But I wasn't naive. I knew Howard wouldn't leave without a fight. He still controlled the HOA's records and finances. If he suspected defeat, there was no telling what he might try to destroy before we got our hands on it. That's why I made sure every document, every piece of evidence was copied, scanned, and backed up in multiple places. If they tried to cover their tracks, I'd already preserved the trail. The night before the election, I saw headlights outside my house. A car idled at the curb for nearly 20 minutes before driving away. It might have been nothing, or it might have been someone trying to intimidate me. Either way, I didn't flinch. I come too far to back down now. The morning of the vote dawned clear and bright. Neighbors lined up outside the community center before the doors even opened. The atmosphere felt less like a formal meeting and more like a block party, with people chatting, laughing, and patting each other on the back. For once, the HOA wasn't dividing us. It was bringing us together. When the ballots were counted, the result wasn't even close. All 5 board members were removed in a landslide vote. Cheers erupted, echoing through the building as Howard and his allies slipped out quietly, their faces pale and defeated. For the first time in years, the neighborhood truly belonged to the people who lived there. But while the board was gone, the mess they left behind remained. The HOA's books were a disaster, full of unexplained payments and missing records. We hadn't just removed corrupt leaders. We'd uncovered a financial scandal that could have legal consequences. The HOA board entered the next meeting with smug faces, certain they had me cornered. Their foreclosure threats had escalated, and they believed I would crack under the pressure. But I wasn't coming to this meeting empty-handed. For weeks, I had been gathering information, board budgets, meeting minutes, inconsistencies in their records. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. I had uncovered a trail of financial mismanagement that even the most loyal HOA supporters couldn't ignore. In the days leading up to the meeting, I stayed up late compiling documents. Utility charges billed to the community but benefiting only certain board members, landscaping invoices that didn't match the actual work done, and personal expenses masquerading as administrative costs. I cross-referenced every receipt, every bank statement I could get my hands on, until I had enough evidence to raise serious questions about how the HOA was operating. When I arrived at the community hall that evening, the room was packed. Word had spread about the board's attempt to foreclose over a $200 fine, and neighbors were curious. Some came to see a fight, others out of genuine concern. The board sat in their usual spots at the front, with arms crossed and eyes sharp. Their president, a woman who had made it her mission to control every inch of the neighborhood, smiled like she had already won. I began calmly, laying out the details of how I had paid my dues on time and how their so-called late fee was entirely fabricated. The murmurs in the room grew louder as I explained how they had tried to tack on penalties without any legal justification. But I didn't stop there. I shifted to the financial records. Page by page, I exposed questionable transactions, lavish dinners billed as board meetings, payments to contractors who never showed up, and unexplained cash withdrawals. Every word made the president's smile fade a little more. The audience shifted uneasily. Neighbors who had blindly trusted the board were starting to connect the dots. Why were our HOA fees going up every year while our amenities were falling apart? Why did the board refuse to release the full accounting despite repeated requests? As I spoke, I could feel the atmosphere changing. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was holding up a mirror to the corruption that had been festering for years. People who had once nodded along with every HOA decision were now glaring at the board, whispering among themselves. By the time I finished, the room was silent. The board tried to deflect, claiming I was misinterpreting the records, but the damage was done. Homeowners who had stayed neutral up until now were demanding answers. The president's voice trembled as she insisted that all the expenses were necessary and authorized. But the confidence was gone. I knew I had shifted the power dynamic. No longer was I a single homeowner standing alone against an iron-fisted board. Now, I was the spark igniting long-simmering frustration within the community. Several neighbors volunteered to form an independent committee to audit the HOA's finances. Others called for an emergency vote to remove certain board members. The president tried to adjourn the meeting abruptly, but the crowd wouldn't let her walk out without addressing the allegations. Leaving that meeting, I felt the tide turning in my favor. But I also knew the board wouldn't go down quietly. People like them rarely do. Their pride was wounded, and wounded pride is dangerous. I had embarrassed them in front of the entire neighborhood. If they had been determined to take my house before, now they would be relentless. Sure enough, the very next morning, I received a thick envelope on my doorstep. Another legal notice, this time threatening accelerated foreclosure proceedings. It was clear they were trying to intimidate me into silence. But what they didn't realize was that they had just pushed me to fight harder. I had already started talking to local reporters, sending them the same financial documents I'd shown the neighborhood. If the board thought they could keep this quiet, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Rumors spread quickly after that meeting. Homeowners who rarely spoke to each other were suddenly comparing notes about strange fees and hidden assessments. Someone even discovered that the board had been fining other residents for petty violations that didn't actually exist in the HOA bylaws. It became clear this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about years of unchecked abuse of power. While the board scrambled to maintain control, I prepared my next move. I contacted an attorney specializing in HOA disputes, someone with a reputation for dismantling corrupt boards. He reviewed my case and confirmed what I had suspected. Their foreclosure threat was built on sand. If they tried to push it in court, their entire operation could collapse under scrutiny. That was exactly what I wanted. The board thought they could scare me off with threats, but they had only managed to expose their own weakness. And with the community now questioning their every decision, their grip on power was slipping fast. The next HOA meeting was only a week away, and word had spread that something big was coming. Homeowners who had never attended before promised to show up. The board was cornered, but I knew they still had tricks left to play. Their pride wouldn't let them admit defeat. Not yet. As I gathered the last pieces of evidence and prepared to confront them head-on, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my own home anymore. I was fighting to protect everyone in the neighborhood from being bullied the way I had been. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like victory was within reach. The morning of the HOA's emergency meeting dawned colder than expected, the kind of chill that seeps through your jacket and warns of change. By then, word of my investigation had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Curious residents, once silent bystanders to the HOA's tyranny, were eager to see what all the fuss was about. They trickled into the community hall long before the scheduled time, filling the room with a restless hum of anticipation. The board members sat at the front table, stiff and defensive. Their faces betrayed a mix of arrogance and unease, the expressions of people accustomed to being obeyed but sensing their power slipping away. The president, a woman who had orchestrated much of the pressure against me, wore a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Papers were shuffled nervously, whispers exchanged in clipped tones. They still believed this was about a single homeowner fighting a minor fine. They had no idea what was about to hit them. When the meeting opened, they attempted to frame the gathering as a simple review of delinquent dues. But the moment they tried to pivot to my supposed non-payment, I stood up, calm and deliberate, and walked to the front with a thick folder in hand. The room went quiet. Even those who usually avoided confrontation leaned forward, sensing the tension about to snap. I began to lay out my case. Line by line, document by document, I exposed how the HOA had been systematically inflating fines, mismanaging funds, and bullying homeowners into paying without question. I presented bank records, meeting transcripts, and correspondence showing their repeated refusal to provide financial transparency, all while threatening to foreclose on properties over trivial sums. My so-called $200 unpaid fine was just a pretext, a manufactured excuse to intimidate me. But in their greed, they had left a paper trail wide enough for anyone to follow. As the evidence stacked up, the atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with me were now glaring at the board. Whispers turned into open murmurs. Some recorded videos on their phones. I could see fear flicker across the president's face as I detailed how funds meant for community maintenance had been quietly redirected into projects that benefited only a select few, including cosmetic upgrades to her own property. When I reached the climax of my presentation, the proof that they had deliberately targeted homeowners they thought were too weak or uninformed to fight back, the room erupted. Residents demanded answers, some standing and shouting over the board's attempts to restore order. The HOA president tried to adjourn the meeting, but it was too late. The crowd no longer feared them. Neighbors began recounting their own stories. Unjust citations, unexplained fees, intimidation letters slipped under their doors. What had been an isolated grievance now revealed itself as a pattern of abuse. And it was all happening out in the open, with dozens of witnesses capturing every moment on camera. By the time I finished, the board members looked cornered and desperate. Their power, once so absolute, had dissolved under the weight of truth and collective outrage. Residents were already calling for a vote to remove the entire board. The president's voice cracked as she tried to defend herself, but no one was listening anymore. Within a week, an emergency election was held. The corrupt members were voted out by a landslide, replaced by people who actually cared about the community rather than lining their pockets. Financial audits were ordered, illegal fines refunded, and new rules put in place to prevent abuse of power. The foreclosure threat against my home was withdrawn immediately, and my name was cleared. But for me, it wasn't just about saving my house. It was about proving that no one, not even a powerful HOA board, is untouchable when people stand up for themselves. What they tried to use as a weapon, a petty $200 fine, became the very thread that unraveled their control. The neighborhood changed after that day. People started talking to each other more, comparing notes, watching out for signs of unfair treatment. The fear that once hung over our community was replaced with solidarity. And every time I walked past the old president's house, I saw her curtains twitch, as if she couldn't bear to meet my gaze. They thought they could bully me into submission, maybe even steal my home. But instead, they lost everything they had built through intimidation and lies. I didn't just turn the tables. I flipped them over completely, right in front of everyone. The victory wasn't loud or celebratory. It was steady, powerful, and final. My house was safe, the HOA was rebuilt, and the neighborhood was no longer a playground for petty tyrants. And as I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over a street that finally felt like home, I realized something important. Power only works when people are too scared to challenge it. The moment you shine a light on corruption, it begins to crumble, no matter how big or small it seems. 3.